They found it on the morning of August 7th, 1944, approximately 3 kilometers south of Vire, in the Normandy hedgerow country. The Sherman tank sat abandoned in a drainage ditch, its right track blown off by a Panzerfaust hit that had disabled the vehicle without destroying it. Hauptmann Klaus Becker of the Wehrmacht's Heereswaffenamt, the Army Weapons Office, had been sent forward specifically to examine captured American armor. He approached the tank with 2 engineering officers and a photographer, moving carefully through the morning mist that still clung to the Norman countryside. The Sherman was a medium tank variant, designated M4A1 by American nomenclature. It had been part of the 2nd Armored Division's push toward Mortain. The crew had evacuated successfully after the mobility kill, taking their personal equipment but leaving the vehicle largely intact. Becker climbed onto the rear deck and dropped through the turret hatch into the fighting compartment. The interior smelled of oil, cordite residue, and the peculiar metallic scent that characterized all armored vehicles. He switched on his electric torch and began his examination. What he found in the next 30 minutes would fundamentally alter his understanding of how the Americans approached armored warfare. Mounted to the gun, connected through a series of mechanical linkages to the turret traverse and elevation controls, was a device Becker recognized immediately from technical intelligence reports. It was a Westinghouse gyroscopic stabilizer, a mechanism that used a spinning mass to detect and compensate for the vertical movement of the tank's hull. The device was mechanical, precise, and represented an approach to fire control that German engineers had considered and rejected years earlier. Becker photographed it from multiple angles. He sketched the linkage system in his field notebook. He operated the manual controls, feeling how the stabilizer resisted movement when powered, and how it disengaged cleanly when the gunner needed full manual control. And as he worked, crouched in the cramped turret of an enemy tank in the middle of a war zone, he began to understand something that had nothing to do with the mechanism itself. The stabilizer was not particularly sophisticated by German engineering standards. The optical sights the Americans used were inferior to German Zeiss optics. The gun itself, a 75mm M3, had less penetrating power than the German 75mm Quebec 40 liters, 48, and was dramatically inferior to the 88mm guns mounted on Tigers and Panthers. But the Americans had solved a different problem. They had not tried to make the perfect shot. They had mechanized the process of making adequate shots quickly and consistently while moving. CTA placement. After 145 words. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Continue narration. Becker had spent 18 months testing German tanks at the Kummersdorf, proving ground south of Berlin. He knew German gunnery doctrine intimately. He had watched Tiger crews drill endlessly on precision shooting from static positions. He had read the after-action reports from North Africa, from the Eastern Front, from Italy. German tanks achieved kills at ranges the Americans could not match. German gunners were trained to a standard of accuracy that made them the finest precision shooters in any army. German fire control equipment, particularly the stereoscopic rangefinders used in some vehicles, represented the cutting edge of optical technology. And yet, the Americans were winning the tank war in Normandy. They were winning despite having inferior guns, despite having thinner armor on their Shermans compared to Panthers and Tigers, despite having crews with less training time than their German counterparts. Becker climbed out of the Sherman as the August sun began burning off the morning mist. He did not yet fully understand what he had discovered, but he knew with absolute certainty that it mattered. The question that would occupy him for the remainder of the war, and indeed for the rest of his life, was simple. How could mechanical adequacy defeat human excellence? To understand what Becker found so disturbing in that abandoned Sherman, it is necessary to understand the foundation upon which German armoured doctrine had been built. German tank gunnery in 1944 was not simply good. It was the product of a systematic philosophy that dated back to the earliest days of German rearmament in the 1930s, refined through years of combat experience, and embodied in training programs that produced what many historians consider the finest precision tank gunners of World War II. The philosophy began with optics. Carl Zeiss, the legendary optical company based in Jena, had been producing military optics since the late 19th century. By the time German tank production began in earnest in the mid-1930s, Zeiss had developed stereoscopic rangefinders, periscopic sights, and telescopic gun sights that were simply without peer in the world. The TZF-9 series of telescopic sights, standard equipment in German tanks from the Panzer III onward, provided 2.5 times magnification with exceptional clarity and light transmission. The reticle patterns were scientifically calculated to allow precise range estimation and lead calculation for moving targets. German gunners trained with these instruments for months before being considered combat-ready. At the Panzertruppenschule, the armor school at Wunsdorf, instructors drilled students in the fundamentals of range estimation using terrain features, target size comparison, and the mil-dot ranging systems incorporated into their sights. A German tank gunner was expected to estimate range to within 50 meters at distances up to 1,500 meters. He practiced on mock-up targets, on moving vehicles, on silhouettes that appeared briefly and then disappeared. The training was rigorous, technical, and demanding. The doctrine that emerged from this training emphasized the first shot kill. German tactical manuals stressed the importance of achieving firing position, identifying the target, calculating range, and delivering a precise shot before the enemy could respond. This approach had proven devastatingly effective in the early war years. In France in 1940, German tanks had outfought French armor that was often superior in gun power and armor protection, winning through superior tactics and crew coordination. In North Africa, German tank crews achieved kill ratios that seemed impossible, destroying 3 or 4 British tanks for every German vehicle lost. The crews who fought in these campaigns developed an almost aristocratic pride in their precision. They were craftsmen of violence, artists of the aimed shot. Günther Halm, a gunner in the 5th Panzer Division who fought in North Africa and later in Normandy, described the experience in a post-war interview conducted by British interrogators. "We would position ourselves, often hull down, and wait for the enemy to appear. When they came, we would range them carefully, sometimes taking 30 seconds or even a minute to ensure the first shot would kill. It usually did. The British tanks would often fire first, but their shots would miss or fail to penetrate. Our shot would hit, would penetrate, would kill." This confidence extended to the tank designers and the military leadership. When German engineers at companies like Henschel, Mann, and Porsche designed new tanks, they prioritized gun power and armor protection over mobility. The Tiger, introduced in 1942, weighed 54 tons and could barely manage 23 miles per hour on roads, but it mounted an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The Panther, introduced in 1943, was faster and more mobile, but still weighed 45 tons and prioritized frontal armor thickness and gun performance over speed. The underlying assumption was clear. A well-positioned German tank with a properly trained crew could dominate any engagement through superior firepower and precision gunnery. The tank was a mobile gun platform. Its purpose was to achieve a position from which it could deliver accurate fire. Movement was secondary to shooting. The training system that produced these gunners was perhaps the most sophisticated in the world. At Wunsdorf and other armor schools across Germany, instructors used a progression of training that began with classroom instruction in ballistics, optics, and fire control, advanced to simulator training using mechanical devices that replicated turret controls and gun sights, and culminated in live fire exercises using increasingly difficult scenarios. The classroom phase could last weeks. Students learned the trajectory characteristics of different ammunition types. Armor-piercing rounds with tungsten cores had flatter trajectories than standard armor-piercing shot. High-explosive rounds had more drop over distance. The gunner needed to understand these differences and select the appropriate ammunition for each target. They studied the penetration tables that showed which ammunition could defeat which thickness of armor at which ranges and angles. A Panther's 75mm gun firing Pedsgr 39 over 42 armor-piercing shot could penetrate 138mm of vertical armor at 500 meters. At 1,000 meters, penetration dropped to 124mm. At 1,500 meters, 111mm. German gunners memorized these tables. They needed to know instantly whether they could penetrate a target from their current position or whether they needed to maneuver to a different angle or close the range. This was not information that could be looked up during combat. It had to be internalized, available at a moment's notice. The simulator training used mechanical devices mounted in mock turrets. The student sat in the gunner's position with a realistic sight picture and turret controls. Instructors would present target silhouettes at varying ranges and angles. The student would estimate range, traverse the turret, elevate the gun, and simulate firing. The instructor would then inform the student whether the shot would have hit and penetrated. Thousands of repetitions built the muscle memory and judgment that would be required in combat. Live fire training consumed ammunition at rates that would have been unthinkable in most armies. German doctrine specified that each gunner should fire at least 50 main gun rounds during training, engaging targets from various ranges and angles. The best gunners fired considerably more. The ammunition expenditure was justified by the results. A properly trained German gunner in a Panther or Tiger represented a capability that was difficult to replace. The months of training, the institutional knowledge, the combat experience could not be easily replicated. Therefore, the investment in thorough initial training was considered worthwhile. The results of this system were evident in combat statistics from across the war. In North Africa, Tiger tanks of Schwere Panzerabteilung 501 achieved extraordinary kill ratios during their initial deployment. In one engagement near Taborba in December 1942, a single Tiger commanded by Hauptmann Freiherr von Nolde destroyed 11 Allied tanks and 3 anti-tank guns in approximately 20 minutes of fighting. The Tiger suffered no penetrations. Similar stories emerged from the Eastern Front, where German tank crews regularly defeated numerically superior Soviet forces through superior gunnery and tactics. By 1944, German tankers had come to view their gunnery superiority as an inherent advantage. It was not merely that they had better training and better equipment. It was that they represented a superior approach to armored warfare. Precision, patience, and disciplined fire control were the hallmarks of the professional soldier. The German tanker was a specialist, a master of his craft, trained to standards that few other armies could match. This was the belief system, the foundation of confidence, that Klaus Becker carried with him when he climbed into that captured Sherman south of Vire. He knew German tanks were better. He knew German gunners were better. He knew German doctrine was based on proven principles, refined through years of combat. What he discovered in the Sherman's turret would challenge every one of those assumptions, not by proving them wrong, but by revealing that the Americans had made them irrelevant. The Westinghouse gyroscopic stabilizer that Becker examined in that Sherman turret was not a secret weapon. American tankers did not regard it as revolutionary technology. To them, it was simply standard equipment, as unremarkable as the radio or the periscopes. The device had been in development since the late 1930s, when Westinghouse Electric began working with the United States Army Ordnance Department on methods to improve tank gunnery accuracy while moving. The basic principle was straightforward. A gyroscope, essentially a heavy disc spinning at high speed, resists changes to its orientation in space. If you mount such a device to a gun and connect it through a series of mechanical linkages to the gun's elevation controls, the gyroscope will detect when the tank's hull pitches up or down and will automatically adjust the gun's elevation to compensate. The gun remains pointed at the same spot in space, even as the tank moves over uneven ground. The Westinghouse system used a gyroscope spinning at approximately 4,000 revolutions per minute. The gyro was mounted in a housing beneath the gun, connected through a complex series of gears, clutches, and hydraulic actuators to the gun's elevation mechanism. When engaged, the system would maintain the gun's elevation within approximately 1 degree of true horizontal, regardless of the tank's pitching motion. The gunner could still manually adjust elevation to aim at targets, but the stabilizer would maintain that aimed elevation as the tank moved. The system was not perfect. It only stabilized the vertical axis, not the horizontal. This meant the gun remained level as the tank pitched forward and backward over terrain, but did not compensate for the turning motion as the tank changed direction. The stabilizer also had limitations in how quickly it could respond to violent motion. If the tank dropped off a sharp embankment or hit a large obstacle at speed, the stabilizer would lose its reference and would need several seconds to re-engage. American technical manuals for the Sherman acknowledged these limitations explicitly. The manual for the M4 medium tank, revised in April 1944, included detailed instructions for operating the stabilizer. It noted that the system was most effective at speeds between 5 and 15 miles per hour on moderately uneven ground. At higher speeds or on very rough terrain, the manual advised disengaging the stabilizer and relying on traditional aimed fire from brief halts. But within its operational envelope, the stabilizer provided a significant advantage. An American Sherman moving at 10 miles per hour across moderately rough ground could engage targets with reasonable accuracy at ranges up to 800 yards. The shots would not be as precise as carefully aimed shots from a stationary position, but they would be adequate for hitting a tank-sized target. More importantly, the Sherman could deliver these shots continuously while moving, maintaining fire on the enemy without stopping. German tankers could not do this. A Panther or Tiger moving across country at comparable speeds could not aim effectively. The gun would pitch up and down with the hull motion. The gunner, looking through his telescopic sight, would see the target bouncing wildly in his field of view. Attempting to fire while moving would waste ammunition on shots that had virtually no chance of hitting. German doctrine therefore required tanks to stop before firing. The standard procedure was to halt, identify the target, aim carefully, fire, and then move to a new position if necessary. The time difference seemed small, perhaps 10 to 15 seconds to stop, aim, and fire, compared to firing immediately while moving. But in combat, those seconds accumulated. A Sherman platoon of 5 tanks moving toward a German position could deliver 25 shots in the time it took a German platoon to stop, aim carefully, and deliver 5. The German shots would be more accurate individually, but the Americans achieved through volume of fire what the Germans achieved through precision. Becker's report, submitted to the Heereswaffenamt on August 14, 1944, detailed the stabilizer's mechanical characteristics with typical German thoroughness. He described the gyroscope mounting, the linkage system, the engagement and disengagement mechanisms. He estimated the stabilizer's performance parameters based on his examination and on interviews with German tankers who had engaged Shermans in combat. The report concluded with a section that his superiors found troubling. The American stabilization system, Becker wrote, represents a fundamentally different approach to the fire control problem. Our doctrine emphasizes precision engagement from prepared positions. We train our gunners to achieve first-shot kills at maximum effective range. The Americans have mechanized a solution that allows continuous fire while maneuvering. They have traded precision for volume and mobility. In terrain that restricts fields of view and engagement ranges, such as the bocage country of Normandy, this approach negates our advantages in optics and gunnery training. The report circulated through Wehrmacht headquarters during late August and early September 1944. By this time, the disaster in Normandy was complete. German forces had been encircled at Falaise, with catastrophic losses in men and equipment. The survivors were retreating toward Germany's borders. Tank units that had entered Normandy with 50 or 60 vehicles reported strengths of 10 or 15. The losses were attributed to many factors: Allied air superiority, overwhelming artillery concentrations, the numerical superiority of Allied armour, and the difficulty of the defensive fighting in the hedgerows. But some officers who read Becker's report recognized something more fundamental. Major Gerhard Zander, a staff officer with 5th Panzer Army who had personally witnessed multiple tank engagements in Normandy, wrote a marginal note on his copy of the report that was later preserved in captured German documents. This explains what we observed repeatedly. American tanks would advance in groups while firing continuously. Our tanks would stop to engage them with aimed fire. We would achieve kills at better than a 2-to-1 ratio. But there were always more American tanks. They would keep moving, keep firing, and eventually overwhelm our positions through sheer persistence. We interpreted this as crude tactics by poorly trained crews. We were wrong. They were using their equipment as designed. The recognition came too late to change German doctrine or to influence German tank design. By September 1944, Germany no longer had the industrial capacity to redesign and re-equip its armoured forces. The factories were struggling to produce existing designs under increasingly difficult conditions. Allied bombing had disrupted production and supply chains. Critical materials, particularly the tungsten needed for armour-piercing ammunition and the molybdenum used in armour plate, were in short supply. German tank production in the final months of 1944 was focused on simply maintaining enough vehicles to equip existing units, not on incorporating new technologies. Even if Germany had possessed the capacity to develop and produce stabilization systems, the fundamental problem was not technological. The stabilizer was not beyond German engineering capabilities. German manufacturers had produced similar gyroscopic devices for aircraft instruments and naval fire control systems. Askania, a Berlin-based manufacturer of precision instruments, had developed gyroscopic stabilizers for aircraft bomb sites that were considerably more sophisticated than the Westinghouse tank stabilizer. The problem was doctrinal and philosophical. German military thought had been shaped by the concept of qualitative superiority. A smaller force of superior equipment, operated by better-trained personnel, could defeat a larger force of inferior quality. This principle had worked in the early war years when Germany faced opponents who were genuinely inferior in training and equipment. It had worked in Poland, in France, in the early phases of the Eastern Front campaign. German tanks crewed by professional soldiers had achieved extraordinary results against numerically superior but poorly coordinated enemy forces. The Americans represented something different. They were not attempting to match German quality. They were industrializing warfare itself, mechanizing not just the vehicles, but the entire process of combat. The industrial statistics that German intelligence gathered during 1944 revealed the scale of the challenge. American tank production for the year 1944 alone totaled 17,565 Sherman medium tanks. This did not include light tanks, tank destroyers, or armoured vehicles. Just medium tanks. 17,565 vehicles in a single year from multiple manufacturers operating in a nation that had never produced tanks in significant numbers before 1942. Germany, by comparison, produced 5,966 medium and heavy tanks in 1944. This included Panthers, Tigers, and the various assault gun variants that equipped German armoured formations. The production figure represented the maximum output Germany could achieve under wartime conditions with its entire industrial base mobilized. The ratio was nearly 3-to-1 in favor of the Americans, and this was for just one Allied nation. British tank production added thousands more vehicles. Soviet production dwarfed both Western allies combined, but the numbers alone did not convey the full disparity. German tanks, particularly the Panther and Tiger, were mechanically complex and difficult to maintain. The Panther's transmission had a disturbing tendency to fail after approximately 150 kilometers of operation. The Tiger's overlapping road wheel design would freeze solid in Russian winter conditions, rendering the tank immobile until the ice could be chipped away. German tanks consumed fuel at extraordinary rates. A Tiger burned approximately 1 gallon of fuel for every half-mile of travel. In defensive operations where fuel supplies were limited, German armour was often immobilized, not by enemy action but by empty fuel tanks. American Shermans were not without their problems, but they were fundamentally more reliable. The mechanical systems were simpler, the parts were standardized, and the maintenance requirements were within the capabilities of reasonably trained crews. A Sherman could operate for hundreds of miles with routine maintenance. When major repairs were needed, American logistics provided the parts and the specialized maintenance units to perform them. Tanks that were damaged in combat were often recovered, repaired, and returned to service within days. Second, CTA placement. Around 2,900 words. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Continue narration. German tank crews who survived the Normandy campaign and retreated into Germany encountered another aspect of American industrial capability that was perhaps even more demoralizing than the Sherman's: stabilizer. They discovered that the Americans treated tanks as expendable assets. A Sherman knocked out in combat would be replaced, often within 24 hours, by a new Sherman pulled from the massive supply network that fed Allied forces. The crew would be reassigned to the new tank, and the unit would return to combat strength as if the loss had never occurred. German Panzer divisions that lost tanks in combat faced weeks or months before replacement vehicles arrived, if they arrived at all. By late 1944, German armoured formations were operating at a fraction of their authorised strength. A Panzer division that was supposed to field over 100 tanks might have 30 or 40 operational vehicles. The shortfall was not because the tanks had been destroyed faster than they could be replaced, though that was certainly true. It was because Germany's industrial system could not produce tanks at a rate sufficient to sustain prolonged combat operations against an opponent with America's industrial capacity. Oberst Hans von Luck, who commanded a panzer regiment in the 21st Panzer Division, described the realization in his post-war memoir. "We knew our tanks were better in direct combat. A Panther could destroy a Sherman from ranges where the Sherman's gun was ineffective. But for every Sherman we destroyed, 2 more appeared. Our Panthers, when lost, were gone. We had no replacements. We were watching our strength erode, not through defeat in battle, but through simple arithmetic." Klaus Becker survived the war. He was captured by American forces in April 1945 near the Ruhr Pocket and spent 14 months in a prisoner of war camp before being repatriated to Germany in mid-1946. During his captivity, he was interviewed multiple times by American technical intelligence officers who were compiling comprehensive reports on German armored vehicle development and doctrine. The interview transcripts, preserved in the United States National Archives, reveal a man struggling to reconcile what he had believed with what he had witnessed. In one interview conducted in September 1945, Becker was asked directly about German reactions to the Sherman's stabilizer. His response, translated from German, was recorded as follows: "We understood the mechanism. It was not complicated, but we did not understand why the Americans thought it was necessary. Our doctrine did not call for firing while moving. We considered it wasteful and imprecise. Only after Normandy did some of us begin to realize that the Americans were not trying to match our precision. They were solving a different problem entirely. They were mechanizing warfare in ways we had not conceived." The interviewer pressed Becker on whether German engineers could have developed similar systems. Becker's answer was telling. "Of course we could have. The technology was not beyond us, but we would not have wanted to. It would have seemed like admitting that our crews were not capable of proper gunnery discipline." The stabilizer was a mechanical solution to a problem we believed should be solved through training. This was our error. We thought the problem was how to make the perfect shot. The Americans understood the problem was how to deliver adequate fire faster than the enemy could respond. This philosophical gap extended beyond fire control systems. German tank design throughout the war prioritized gunpowder and armor protection, producing vehicles that were formidable in direct combat, but difficult to produce, maintain, and operate. The Tiger II, introduced in early 1944, weighed 69 tons and mounted an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,500 meters. It was perhaps the most powerful tank that saw combat in World War II. Germany produced only 492 of them, The United States produced more Shermans in a single month than Germany produced Tiger IIs during the entire war. American tank design prioritized different characteristics: reliability, ease of production, ease of maintenance, and adequate rather than superior performance. The Sherman was not the best tank of World War II by any traditional metric. Its armor was thinner than German heavy tanks. Its gun was less powerful, but it could be produced in enormous quantities, could be shipped across oceans, could be maintained by crews with modest technical training, and could engage enemy armor effectively when employed in the numbers that American industry made possible. The stabilizer embodied this philosophy. It did not make the Sherman superior to a Panther in a direct one-on-one engagement. A Panther with a trained crew fighting from a prepared position would defeat a Sherman more often than not. But the stabilizer allowed Shermans to fight while maneuvering, to deliver continuous fire while advancing, to maintain offensive pressure that disrupted German defensive tactics. Combined with American numerical superiority, air support, and artillery, the stabilizer contributed to a system of warfare that German doctrine had no effective answer for. German veterans who survived the war and later wrote about their experiences consistently emphasized this disparity. They described fighting competently, achieving local tactical successes, destroying more enemy tanks than they lost in individual engagements, and still losing ground steadily because the Americans simply had more of everything. More tanks, more ammunition, more fuel, more replacement crews, more support aircraft, more artillery tubes. The material superiority was so overwhelming that tactical excellence became increasingly irrelevant. The story of the Sherman stabilizer is not primarily about technology. It is about competing philosophies of warfare and the industrial systems that supported them. German military thought in World War II was rooted in concepts that had served Prussia and Germany well in previous conflicts. Superior training, superior doctrine, and superior equipment operated by a professional military establishment could overcome numerical disadvantages. This approach had worked against France in 1870, had nearly worked against Russia and France simultaneously in World War I, and had worked spectacularly in the early years of World War II. The approach failed against the United States because America did not fight the war Germany expected. American doctrine did not emphasize individual excellence or technological sophistication. It emphasized standardization, mass production, and overwhelming material superiority. The American military-industrial system was designed to produce adequate equipment in quantities that made qualitative differences increasingly meaningless. The Sherman stabilizer was one small example of this broader philosophy. It was not the best possible solution to the fire control problem. A more sophisticated system with full two-axis stabilization, better optics, and faster response time would have been superior. But such a system would have been more expensive, more complex, and more difficult to produce in quantity. The Westinghouse stabilizer was good enough. It provided a meaningful advantage at a cost that allowed it to be installed in thousands of tanks. That calculation, the willingness to accept good enough rather than insisting on best possible, characterized American procurement throughout the war. German procurement worked differently. When German engineers identified a problem, they designed the best possible solution regardless of manufacturing complexity or resource requirements. The Panther's sloped armor was mechanically more difficult to produce than vertical armor but provided superior protection. The Tiger's 88mm gun was more expensive and consumed more resources than smaller weapons but provided overwhelming firepower. German optical sights were manufactured to tolerances that increased cost but improved performance. Every design decision prioritized quality over quantity. This approach made sense within the framework of German strategic thinking. Germany expected short wars against individual opponents. The concept of blitzkrieg, lightning war, assumed that superior German forces would achieve decisive victories quickly, before enemy mobilization could negate Germany's qualitative advantages. In this context, having a smaller number of superior tanks was rational. The tanks would win battles quickly enough that long-term production rates were less important than immediate battlefield superiority. The strategy failed when Germany found itself in a multi-front war of attrition against opponents with greater population and industrial resources. The Soviet Union could lose thousands of tanks and replace them. The United States could produce more tanks than Germany could destroy. Britain could sustain losses that would have been crippling to Germany. The war became not a series of decisive campaigns but a grinding contest of industrial mobilization, and in such a contest, Germany's emphasis on quality became a strategic liability. By 1944, German tank crews were operating the finest armoured vehicles ever produced to that point in history. The Panzer was a masterpiece of design, combining a powerful gun with excellent armour protection and reasonable mobility. The Tiger, while mechanically troublesome, was nearly invulnerable from the front and could destroy enemy armour at ranges where return fire was impossible. German optics remained superior to Allied equivalents throughout the war. German gunnery training continued to produce crews whose precision was unmatched, and Germany was losing the tank war decisively. Not because German tanks were inferior in direct combat, but because the context of combat had shifted. The question was no longer which tank could win an individual engagement. The question was which industrial system could sustain combat operations indefinitely while replacing losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Germany had optimized for the wrong problem. Klaus Becker's moment of recognition in that abandoned Sherman south of Vire in August 1944 represents something larger than one engineer's realization. It represents the collision between two different philosophies of modern warfare, two different approaches to industrial mobilization, and two different understandings of what would matter in mid-20th century combat. The stabilizer itself was almost incidental. It was simply the mechanism that made visible a truth that had already been determined by decisions made years earlier in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Washington regarding how America would organize its war production. The German approach to tank warfare was not wrong within its own logic. Precision gunnery from well-trained crews using superior optics and powerful weapons had proven devastatingly effective across multiple campaigns. The tactical doctrine that emphasized first-shot kills from prepared positions was sound and had achieved remarkable results. The tanks themselves, particularly the late-war Panthers and Tigers, were magnificent machines that represented the peak of German engineering expertise. German tankers had every reason to be confident in their equipment and their training, but confidence built on past success can become a trap when circumstances change. The war Germany found itself fighting by 1944 was not the war German doctrine had been designed to win. It was not a war of rapid maneuver and decisive battles. It was a war of attrition, where industrial capacity mattered more than tactical excellence. The stabilizer in the Sherman's turret was a physical manifestation of how the Americans had understood this reality and designed their equipment accordingly. The Americans had not tried to build tanks that could beat German tanks in one-on-one combat. They had built tanks that were good enough, produced them in overwhelming numbers, created a logistics system that kept them supplied and maintained, and developed tactics that exploited numerical superiority. The stabilizer allowed those tanks to maintain offensive pressure while maneuvering, turning adequate equipment into an effective weapon system through volume of fire and continuous movement. This was the realization that struck Becker and other German officers who examined captured American equipment. The Americans were not playing the same game. They had changed the rules, had redefined what constituted victory in armored warfare. A German Panther might destroy 3 Shermans before being knocked out, but the Americans could afford to lose 3 Shermans. They had 17,000 more in production. Germany could not afford to lose the Panther because there was no replacement available. The lesson extended beyond tanks. It applied to aircraft production, where American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft during the war compared to Germany's 120,000. It applied to logistics, where American trucks and ships moved supplies in quantities that German planners found almost incomprehensible. It applied to ammunition production, where American industry manufactured 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition compared to Germany's 10 billion. At every level, American industrial mobilization overwhelmed German qualitative advantages through sheer quantity. For the men who fought the war, the experience was often bitter. German tankers knew they were better trained. They knew their equipment was superior in direct combat. They achieved higher kill ratios in most engagements, and they lost. They lost Normandy, they lost France, they lost the Rhineland, and finally, they lost Germany itself. The loss was not because they fought poorly or because their equipment failed. It was because excellence could not overcome arithmetic. When Klaus Becker climbed out of that Sherman in August 1944, he carried with him the knowledge that Germany had already lost the tank war, perhaps had lost it years earlier when American factories began production, before a single Sherman had fired a shot in combat. The stabilizer was just the messenger. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.